It was 1943 in a quiet village in Bavaria, Germany. The sun cast a golden glow over wheat fields, and at first glance, life seemed untouched by war. Children played in the streets, farmers tended their fields, and smoke rose from chimneys. But beneath the calm, the war was everywhere. Hans Bauer, a farmer in his early 40s, knew this well. He had served briefly in the Wehrmacht and returned home after witnessing the Eastern Front's horrors. He had seen friends die, neighbors disappear, and the brutality of the regime. Returning home, he sought peace, but peace was hard to find in a country gripped by fear. One evening, as Hans checked his barn, he heard soft cries. At first he thought it was an animal, but then a young man stumbled into view, bleeding and shivering. His uniform was torn, his eyes wide with terror. Hans moved instinctively, lifting him into the barn. "You're safe here," Hans whispered. The man, barely 20, introduced himself as James Whitman, an American pilot who had escaped capture. Hans realized the danger immediately. Hiding one Allied soldier could mean death if discovered, but doing nothing was impossible. Over the next days, Hans helped James recover, providing food, water, and warmth. He knew more would follow. Word of a safe place in Bavaria would reach other soldiers, and soon he would face a choice: turn them away or risk everything to save them. He decided to act. Hans converted his barn into a sanctuary. Hidden compartments beneath floorboards, false walls, secret nooks behind hay bales. Every inch was a potential hiding place. Food and water were carefully rationed, and he studied patrol routes, learning when the village was safe. The first real test came when German soldiers arrived unexpectedly. They knocked on the barn door, inspected the surroundings, and asked questions. Hans stayed calm. "I live alone," he said, "just feeding the animals." Hours passed. Officers circled the barn, suspicious but convinced by Hans's calmness. When they left, the soldiers hiding beneath floorboards exhaled, hearts pounding. Hans knew then that every successful night was a small victory. Every mistake could be fatal. By the end of the year, more soldiers arrived, Americans, British, Canadians. Each was guided to hidden spaces, learning the rules of silence, patience, and survival. Hans became their quiet protector, an ordinary man performing extraordinary deeds, risking everything for strangers, and so it began. The quiet heroism of one man, hidden in plain sight, saving lives in a world of fear, without recognition, without glory, only courage. By 1944, Hans Bauer's barn had become a secret refuge for dozens of Allied soldiers. Word spread quietly through resistance networks. A German farmer, quiet and unassuming, was offering sanctuary. Young men from America, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations arrived, weary, hungry, and terrified. Hans worked meticulously. Each day he checked the hidden compartments, floorboards, and false walls. He rationed food carefully, stored water in hidden barrels, and folded blankets into secret nooks. Every arrival added risk. Every night he listened for patrols, footsteps on gravel, barking dogs, or the distant hum of a German truck. One wrong sound could expose him and the men he protected. The soldiers learned quickly. Silence became a language. Whispers were measured. Even a cough or a creak had to be controlled. Nights were the hardest. Men pressed together in hidden spaces, hearts pounding, listening as danger crept close. One winter night, a German officer arrived inspecting barns in the village. Hans greeted him calmly, offering bread and discussing livestock, hiding dozens of soldiers mere feet away. Hours passed, tension stretching time itself. Finally, the officer left, muttering about paperwork, and life continued, but only just. Hans also guided soldiers along secret paths. He led small groups through forests, across frozen rivers, and past patrols, helping them reach safe houses or cross borders into Switzerland. Each escape was a careful choreography of movement, silence, and trust. One misstep, one wrong word, could cost lives. Despite the danger, Hans never faltered. He taught the men patience and courage. He became a shadow in the village, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary in action. By the end of 1944, nearly 200 soldiers had passed through Hans's barn. Some stayed days, some weeks, but all carried away stories of courage and hope. His barn was more than wood and hay. It was a symbol of humanity in a world dominated by fear. And still, Hans remained quiet, returning to his fields each day, tending livestock, repairing his barn, hiding lives in plain sight. He risked everything for strangers, and through his courage, hundreds survived. By early 1945, the war was entering its final months. Across Germany, towns lay in ruins. Families were displaced, cities bombed, and the Reich's authority had crumbled. Yet in a small Bavarian village, one barn remained quietly standing, a simple structure, ordinary to anyone passing by, but extraordinary within. Hans Bauer, the farmer, had sheltered nearly 200 Allied soldiers. Men from America, Britain, Canada, and beyond had found sanctuary beneath his floorboards, behind false walls, and in secret compartments. They were soldiers who had seen death close, who had survived ambushes, bombings, and the horrors of frontline combat. For each, Hans had been the difference between life and death. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the risk of patrols diminished. Yet Hans still felt the weight of his decisions. He remembered the nights when soldiers pressed flat against walls, silent, breath held, hearts hammering as German boots moved overhead. He remembered the first man, James Whitman, the young American pilot who had stumbled into his barn, and every single soldier who had followed. When the war officially ended in May 1945, Hans did not celebrate. There were no parades for him, no medals pinned to his chest, no ceremonies in the village square. To his neighbors, he was still the quiet farmer who repaired his barn, tended his animals, and worked the fields. Yet the men he had saved carried his story in their hearts. Letters and visits began to arrive. Years later, James Whitman returned to the United States and told his family, friends, and fellow veterans about the German farmer who had risked everything to save his life. Lieutenant Richard Moore, a Canadian officer, shared Hans's story in reunions, meetings of veterans groups, and private letters. A British sergeant who had spent weeks hidden in the barn's false walls wrote decades later about the courage of an ordinary man who had made the extraordinary choice to protect strangers. But the story did not end there. Decades later, journalists, historians, and even some surviving soldiers sought Hans Bauer. Some wanted to thank him. Others wanted to study the remarkable logistics of hiding so many men in a small barn without detection. One historian traveled through Bavaria, knocking on doors, following old maps and wartime letters, asking neighbors if they remembered a man who had quietly saved lives. Some villagers had vague recollections, a man with a quiet smile, always working the fields, rarely speaking of the war. But Hans had always kept his secret. Yet, despite the searches, Hans remained elusive. Even as stories spread across continents, he continued to live simply. He repaired his barn, planted wheat in fields, cared for his cows, and tended his small orchard. He lived quietly, a man whose extraordinary acts had gone unnoticed in the wider world, but which had saved hundreds. In later interviews with surviving soldiers, many recalled the fear of being discovered. They spoke of nights pressed against wooden walls, listening to every creak and whisper, and of the calm presence of Hans Bauer in the barn above them, moving with confidence and silence, seemingly unaware of danger, yet entirely aware of it. "He made us believe we could survive," one soldier said decades later, "and in truth, he gave us more than that. He gave us hope." Hans often reflected on the risks he had taken. He remembered the patrols that came too close, the nights when a single mistake could have cost lives, the moments when courage was measured not by action but by restraint and silence. He understood that heroism is not always loud, it does not always come with medals or recognition. Sometimes it is simply a choice to do the right thing when the world seems indifferent, to act when no one will ever know. By the 1960s, people still sought him. Veterans tried to trace him using old letters and wartime maps. Journalists asked neighbors for any leads. Some believed Hans might have perished, others thought he had moved. But he remained in his village, tending the same fields, repairing the same barn, living the same quiet life. Even in his old age, Hans received visitors who had tracked him down. Some were soldiers he had saved, now elderly themselves, filled with gratitude and awe. They would sit with him in the barn, the same barn that had once been a fortress of survival, and speak in whispers of the nights they spent hidden, of the fear, the silence, and the courage that sustained them. Hans would smile quietly, brush off their praise, and say simply, "I did what anyone should have done. It was nothing extraordinary, just the right thing." Yet for those who had survived because of him, and for historians who later studied his actions, it was extraordinary. A single man, living quietly in the Bavarian countryside, had created a sanctuary in the shadow of war. He had defied fear, authority, and the machinery of a violent regime. He had transformed a simple barn into a lifeline for hundreds, and he had done it silently, without fame or recognition. Hans Bauer passed away quietly in his village, surrounded by fields that had long since returned to peace. But his story lived on. Veterans told their children, historians documented his courage, and the barn itself became a symbol, a reminder that ordinary humans can perform extraordinary acts when the world demands it. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that heroism doesn't need witnesses. It does not need applause. It can exist quietly and visibly in the choices of one ordinary person whose courage and humanity ripple across decades, touching hundreds of lives and leaving an enduring legacy that even history can scarcely contain. The quiet heroism of Hans Bauer reminds us that in the darkest times there are still people who choose hope over fear, life over death, and humanity over indifference. That is the legacy he leaves, and it is the story worth telling.